Hello and welcome to Advanced Scrum Master Skills Hour. I'm Audrey Shearer with Lightspeed, and we are a group of trusted business agility advisors supporting lean and agile transformations worldwide. We'll give our attendees just a couple more seconds here to show up. And before introducing our speaker, some logistics for you on the line. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to that recording will be emailed to all attendees this afternoon. We'd love to hear from you during the presentation. Please ask questions in the chat box on the bottom right. Watching this presentation will earn you 1 Scrum Alliance SEU and 1 PMI PDU. We are PMI REP number 3504. We're on Twitter at Lightspeed. I hope to connect with you there. All right, looks like we're ready to go. If you're just joining us, welcome to Advanced Scrum Master Skills Hour. Our presenter today is Lightspeed Executive VP and Managing Partner Arlen Bankston. Arlen was one of the first certified Scrum trainers and has been actively involved in the application and evolution of Agile software development processes such as Scrum, Kanban, and extreme programming for over a decade and a half. His presentation will be about 40 minutes and we'll save plenty of time for questions. All right, Arlen, good morning.
Good morning. Welcome, everyone. So, as Audrey mentioned, we're going to be doing a skills hour, and this class is going to cover some of the same ideas and tactics that you would find in our Advanced Scrum Master training course, but these are all new. So you're getting a sort of a taste of some of the sort of thing you'd see in the class for you to come. And with that, we'll move right on into it. So, as Audrey mentioned, my name is Arlen, and you can see I wrote a book on HR recently there in the Agile organization. And you'll find out a little bit more about me as we go on, actually. Maybe something that even those of you who have met me before don't know. So it's we're going to keep that a little bit of a mystery for the moment. But before I move on, I'd like to try something maybe just a bit unusual. I'm going to clap briefly. And I know I can't hear you, but you can hear me. And what I'd like you to do is, I'll do it once just to demonstrate the pattern. It's a simple one. And then I'd like you to clap in synchronization with me. And I'll mention what this madness is about momentarily. But here we go. Simple. 1, and then 2 claps, and then another. Let's try one more time and try to do it in time with me. Bear with me on this one. It's strange, but I'll explain it. If you happen to synchronize with me that time, and were we to do that a few more times, you might find actually that your thinking patterns would get in something of a synchronization with mine. This is actually, modern neuroscience has shown that actually in many ways, getting people to mirror one another's actions is a way to build trust. It's a way to get people thinking along the same lines with one another. And this was a survival mechanism when we were still emerging in the plains and set upon by wild predators and the like. It was obviously a good idea to stay together. And specifically, if you were to think that when everyone's sleeping, were they to sleep a little closer together, they might have a bit more of a feeling of safety. And so in this sense, all sorts of interesting studies have emerged to show that simple things like holding hands can even do things such as reduce pain between individuals. So why did I show you that? Well, what we're going to be talking about are some ways perhaps to improve your teams. And one of the most fundamental of problems is, of course, trust. We have to have people who can actually believe in one another in order to have anything akin to a self-managing team. If people don't actually know one another, then it's going to be hard for them to rely on one another, especially when they're not in the same area, say remote teams and the like. So one of several tactics we'll show you along the way. But here's the program. We're going to go through a few key points. The first one is that we don't want to let Scrum grow stale. We want to make sure that it stays fresh. We want to make sure that we're actually meeting our teams at the right level of maturity. So this is newer teams versus more advanced ones. They need different sorts of help. You also want to make sure you're taking care of not just teams, but actually the people within the teams. Many times methods such as Scrum can seem to focus just a bit too much and solely on the team as a construct, and people get lost as cogs in the machine, so to speak, sometimes. And it doesn't work for everyone if you don't pay attention to both. You want to make sure that you're stripping things down to the basics, and you want to make sure that you keep evolving. So with that, let's get into it. First of all, we want to make sure that Scrum itself has really evolved over the years. It's changed as people have found situations in which it doesn't work ideally, situations in which it could be done in better ways. And certainly, as with many things, there's actually not one right way to do this. There is basic Scrum, and then there are things that are not, of course. But that's not to say that basic Scrum right out of the box is going to do the job equally well for everyone. So I'm curious, have any of you ever noticed something like this? You go into a company and you find that their values are all askew. They're perhaps even backwards. Looking at some of these, predictability over quality. How many companies, how many teams rely on, let's say, velocity, right? Or rely on the hitting of a date as the first and foremost of objectives. That what we really need is to make sure that we hit the date, right? We need to make sure that we, say, even hit the end of the sprint and get done everything that we committed to. But you might ask yourself, is that really the best idea? Let's say that, for instance, just take the sprint level for a moment. If a team cuts corners to make the end of a sprint and does a somewhat of a halfway job on a story, then obviously this is going to catch up to them in the end. And the feeling of depression and despondence that they're going to get from doing something less than really the job they knew they could do is going to weigh upon them over time, and they're going to get frustrated. Let's take another one, perhaps on the right there, business value over tech debt. Now that may sound strange, but the false manifesto at the top is referring to the fact that many of these are false comparisons, frankly. These are not mutually exclusive principles. In fact, in almost every instance, they're actually quite tied at the hip. They're very closely related to one another, and they influence one another. So taking that one, value over debt, of course, business value and technical debt are intimately related, in as much as if you were to ignore technical debt, eventually you won't be able to deliver much business value. But even more prominently, looking into the original definition of debt, it isn't just about the technical side of things, it's about the learning debt that we're accruing. As we're building products, seeing how people use them, we have the choice, of course, to either take those learnings and feed them back into our backlog and into our process and use that to evolve our product, as was the intention from the start of Agile methods. Or we can just say, no, this is not the most valuable thing, listening perhaps only to a product owner who doesn't really appreciate the technical side of the equation, and it'll end up catching up with us in the end. So you really want to make sure that that people are measuring the right things. If you focus mostly on the things on the left here, in many cases, actually, you end up digging yourself into a bit of a hole over time. So understand the real objectives. Getting out quality product is the real objective here, first and foremost. And having great teams and having them be able to do that is largely a means to that end. So we need to keep the end in mind here and make sure that our companies are looking at the right aspects and continually revisit. Are the measurements we're making, are they helping or hurting us? And I'll come back to that idea. To sort of lay out a aspirational example here, there was a company named Berts Org. They were pretty well described in a book called Reinventing the Organization by Frederic Laloux. And Berts Org is a neighborhood nursing organization in the Netherlands. And basically, they've only been around for a few years. As you can see here, since 2007, they've grown by a factor of about 1,000, which is pretty impressive. Actually, about almost 3,000 for that, 3,000%, right? And so this is, it's fascinating. How did they do this? Well, they form small teams. As it says on the right there, they're 12-person teams, and specifically 12 nurse teams because they're a nursing organization. As a matter of fact, of those 10,000 plus employees, and I believe the number is somewhere around 14,000 at the moment, somewhere on the order of 50 of them are not nurses. Those people are the HR folks. They are the two leaders of the company. They're some Agile coaches and other such supporting roles, but that's it. And so you might wonder, how could that conceivably work, right? Such a large company, quite successful also, as you'll note there on the left. And somehow they get away with virtually no centralized organization, no support organization to speak of, just the barest of minimums in both of those respects. They do it primarily by training their nurses in a fairly holistic fashion. They say, here is what Berts Org is trying to do. We're trying to make better lives for our clients, right? And our clients have different expectations. People are people. And if you think of this as taking care of, let's say, largely elderly patients at home, in particular, those situations, those people are very different from one another. And as such, they require different approaches to healthcare. So the nurses embed themselves. They go into the neighborhoods, they go to the specific homes, they learn how these people operate and what they need, and together they make a plan. It sounds awfully agile, doesn't it? But we're talking about, of course, a whole nother scale than a 7-person Scrum team here. So place that in your heads and just say, this is not to say that your company needs to be like that, but it's a nice bar to aim for, isn't it? If you could achieve even a portion of that autonomy, that degree of self-management, that localized speed of decision making, that ability to craft a custom offering that fits a specific scenario, we would be in a good place. So, all right, moving on here. We need to make sure that if we're going to do this, of course, we don't go straight for the gold like that and try to, create a completely self-managing company right from the get-go. We need to make sure that we start with the basics. This is, of course, a failure of many organizations who say jump straight into huge, complicated scaling frameworks before they have some basic team competence at the delivery level. So we need to make sure we understand the level of maturity, the level of capability, the level of understanding our teams have so that we can help them at the right level. So a metaphor here I'm sure many of you have run across, shu-ha-ri, an Aikido metaphor. And these are levels of development fundamentally. Shu, if you think about it, there is a technique called a kata, and commonly associated with karate. And a kata is fundamentally a kwana, a basic motion, right? A basic pattern. And it's one that you're meant to repeat. And why are you meant to repeat it? So it becomes ingrained in your muscle memory fundamentally. It becomes something you do without thinking, something that is just instinct, right? And you do that constantly. To be totally clear here, you never really leave that level utterly behind. So even masters go back and practice katas occasionally, and they do this to, well, keep their sword sharp, basically, and to make sure that that familiarity doesn't die out over time, as they, of course, acquire new knowledge, and as such, the old knowledge potentially is shoved aside. So you can imagine, rather than just a serialized progression from the bottom to the top here through these levels, it's really more of a bit of an oscillation, right? Where teams are going to be at one place when they start, and say they enter a new sort of project with a new technology platform or a new business domain that's novel to them. They may very well need to return to some of the lower levels in order to regain their sense of confidence and competence here. At the Ha level, basically practitioners in Aikido are beginning to stitch moves together. The Ha level is where you're usually practicing for a lot of the early belt tests. And this is beginning to not really break the rules as such, but rather not just follow along individual patterns, but place them into sequences, place them into actual situations, practice them in real world contexts. So this might involve, for instance, in a martial arts context, sparring. And of course, if you're talking about a Scrum team, this would be a team that's been doing it for a little while at this point. And has begun to get familiarity with what works for them and what doesn't. And the Re level is the one where no rules are being followed at all. This is the level where teams are expected really to make up their own rules. And certainly this is the most interesting place to be because it forces you to think. If you look at masters in any sort of a given martial arts practice, you'll find that in general, they're not following along with the rest of the class, but they're paving their own way. They're teaching one another. They're challenging, finding new situations, new context, and dreaming up new ways to address them. And that's really where we'd like ourselves and our teams to be over time. So, first of all, we need to find out where exactly are our teams and well, how do we know where our teams are? What are some of the techniques for getting there? Well, there are a lot of different assessment tools, platforms. You can see a couple of them on the right there. That's the Agility Health Radar on the right, and in the middle there, you're actually seeing a plugin for Jira. But in both cases here, that's called a Nico calendar, if you're curious. It's one that tracks how team members feel day by day, right? And then you use that as a way to feed into the retrospective. But again, what should we measure? And I've long thought of this in terms of leading and lagging indicators as a formative way to really assess your metrics, if you will, assess your measurement system itself. And in general, if you think of something like, let's say, ROI, right? Where often product owners are counseled to maximize ROI. Well, this is awfully difficult to do when you, of course, have no idea what the ROI is, or even what it could be in many cases, until you know. And actually, it's even worse than that in many cases. You'll probably never know what the ROI is because it's very difficult to measure in any sense. That's why most companies are pretty poor at actually doing it on a project level, especially. So we might say, what's a more useful indicator? Well, for a product owner, it might be something like looking at upfront quality of, say, prototypes or simulations. So you can see down there, I've noted quality, actual quality as a lagging indicator because you don't know what it is for a real world application until it's in real world usage. But that's not to say that you can actually create if you will, a subset or a simulation or a prototype of said application and test to discern the quality there. Quality perhaps in particular respects like usability, understandability, aesthetic appeal, whatever it is that's particularly important to your product or some combination thereof. Let's take another one. Those two center metrics, cycle time and flow, are actually the same thing. Flow is a higher level abstraction of a similar idea of really saying how much stuff are we able to get out and how quickly on an averaged basis, if you will. So looking at a team and saying how much can they deliver, you'll tend to see something like, let's say, cycle time, and that might be used in a team that's appropriating Kanban. Right? They could look at each item and say, how long does a given user story for a new feature take? It takes 2 to 3 days. And we can use that to project. But flow is often used at a much higher level, and this is why I pull this one out in particular. Flow is meant to look not just at a team's delivery, but an entire organization's delivery. It's meant to look across a value stream. And I think this is a more useful way for a Scrum Master at the advanced level to start looking at things as well. Because the fact of the matter is, what your team does and how fast they do it is not usually entirely in their control. And furthermore, the actual delivery of the product or service is often not entirely in the team's control. For instance, you may be familiar with the concept of shifting left, right, or maybe shifting right. Those refer to looking beyond the team to either side of the value stream. Shifting left says what we need to say. We need to look at the business planning process, the budgeting process, the funding process, the things that tend to precede a team even beginning to build a product. Because quite often, in many cases, that is the area where actually there's quite a lot of time taken, and it's often relatively invisible. So once a team begins, we whip them to say go faster, deliver things. But in many cases, if we could speed up the planning process, you could save much greater degrees of time with much less effort. Similarly, shifting right often refers to things like DevOps. It looks at instrumenting the release and operations part of the equation. So there you're able to say, what if a team were to finish and then something sits on a shelf for a month to wait for some other group to put it out there and formalize it? Well, that might not be so bad from, say, a customer perspective. Maybe customers are willing to be patient, but it's extremely bad from the team's perspective. Why? Because if you wait a month, then the team is already too far down the line working on other things to easily go back and change what they built a month ago, which means it's going to be expensive, which means it's probably not going to get done or not done as well as it would have otherwise. If a team can get feedback, let's say conversely, the same day, an hour or two after they build something, and they can get it at some scale by delivering it to some subset of the real production audience for a product that perhaps already exists, then we can get instant feedback and get it in great degree and use that to actually assess and drive the next sprint. So the last one here is happiness. And I've left that to the end because of all of these, this is the only one that's actually a leading indicator. And what I mean by that is team happiness is one that allows you to see problems coming. And it allows you to actually drive into other lower level metrics, which may actually tell you why a team is performing well or poorly, or why they're happy or sad. So in other words, it's not that useful in and of itself for things other than telling you about the team's morale, but morale is indicative of other things. So often you want to look beyond some of the basic Scrum metrics here and say, how can I get something that will actually let me plan the future? Because looking at the past is only so useful in the long term. We really would like to be able to plan ahead. There's also estimation. Estimation is done in many different ways, of course, and I doubt the things I've listed there are novel to most of you, but again, let's look at estimation from a bit of a new perspective. The key question, I think, for estimation is why, right? And the fact of the matter is there are different answers to that question. One of the reasons that we tend to estimate is to be able to set a date, right? And similarly to set a budget. Those are interrelated. We also sometimes estimate in order to understand basically how cheap or expensive something would be in order to determine a cost-benefit analysis. In other words, to determine the proper scope, the proper option to play for a given feature that we might be building, given how valuable it is relative to how difficult it is for the team to deliver it. We may also estimate just to get a sense of if something is small enough for the team to capably both build it and actually test it and change it if they need to. So smaller things tend to be easier to work with all around. That's why it's such a good idea for us to break stories down to small, few day kind of units for teams to build them. It's not just so they get delivered more quickly, it's because they can then be changed more easily, which is of course much of the essence of the Agile process in general. So when we're looking at metrics, I would say none of the ones on the bottom are bad, right? These are all good, effective ways to measure things. But looking at them, there are some things where we might choose between them. Take story points. I'm willing to bet that far and away that is the one that's most commonly used among our audience here. Story points work great in terms of predictive accuracy. They're reasonably quick for a team to derive if they get good at it and have some practice. However, they tend to be very poorly understood by people outside of the team. And this is bad if you're going for things like actually helping stakeholders to understand potential delivery dates and other such things, which is, of course, a large part of the intent. So for that particular idea of understandability, the days per story thing actually, or the story count, can be easier. So in particular, you'll find the story count often associated with the no estimates movement out there. And clearly, it is an estimate at some level, but we're just using a different way to look at it. We're looking at it at a slightly higher level in order to make it easier for the team and a lot more understandable for stakeholders. So with estimation, really the question is, are you able to answer the questions that you're being asked effectively? Are they the right questions to be asked in the first place? If we're going back to our original slide. And does everybody understand what they mean? This is a not inconsequential question. We don't want our teams wasting their time dreaming up numbers that just don't really mean much to anyone. So let's take a fresh look at estimation and make sure we're doing it properly. What about looking at the team's time? Why are we tracking the hours that they're working on development versus testing versus analysis? Are we tracking time that they're spending in meetings or not in meetings and on their laptops, developing the application? What we really want to look at here is we should never measure something without a clear reason for measuring it. Measurement should drive decisions and it should drive behavior. So one of the measurements here, and you'll see a little later on in the presentation, we're going to do a quick survey, but task estimates in hours on burn down charts. This is a classic Scrum metric here, and it's a classic tracking idea. However, it's one that's frequently dropped these days by teams. And why is it dropped? Because they don't need it anymore, and it takes more time and effort than it's worth. So in those cases, that may not be the case if your team is at a shoe level here, but it almost certainly is the case if your team is at a re-level. They've gotten to a point where they know their respective jobs, they know how long things tend to take on average. They've gotten so good at breaking down stories that they're getting done every couple of days anyway. Why bother to break things down to the hour level and track them? You're able to see if you're getting done with the sprint on time or not with a higher level number and less effort. So do that, right? We want to make sure that we're using the simplest thing that's going to work here. What about that second one, productive time versus not? This is an interesting tactic that's employed by many Agile coaches, looking at companies and saying, well, what we really like teams to do is mostly deliver, right? I mean, we don't want them to be stuck in meetings all the time. It's a waste of their time, and it can actually diminish their engagement with the work environment in general. People hate bureaucracy and they hate unnecessary meetings, especially developers. Furthermore, getting pulled into meetings is extremely disruptive to the delivery cycle itself and can have notable impacts on things like velocity. So sometimes you can get a pretty clear idea of what's going on here and, if you will, make cases to your stakeholders to keep your team out of meetings by simply tracking how much time are they spending in them versus doing useful stuff. And you might, track that with a simple tracking button or something akin to that. There are other teams who look at just the basic metrics and deliver that way and do little else. And activity tracking by hour, well, you'd probably prefer not to do it in general, but some companies, public companies in particular, need to capitalize or expense certain activities. And as such, sometimes you'll see organizations tracking those sorts of things. But again, there is a reason there. So you want to ask, what's the right thing we can do here that'll take the least amount of effort and help us more than it'll hurt us? What about people at an individual level? Well, let's look at a little story here. Take Paulo. Paulo is he's Brazilian, and he's just used to working on his own. He's a bit of an introvert, and he always loved working in a dark room with a lamp and just doing really beautiful stuff. And he's joined the Scrum team, and while he's picking up all sorts of interesting new skills and learning all sorts of great things, and he's feeling a real sense of support from his colleagues, he sort of misses the way he used to do things. He misses the opportunity to be more on his own, to be working as a solo artist. And Paulo isn't alone here. There are lots of introverts that you might find in his position. And is Scrum just not right for them? No, right? There are many ways to address this situation. But let's take a poll here very quickly around this particular idea. There are a few things we could do, and you don't necessarily have to choose one best option here. There isn't one, just to be completely clear. But I'm curious, how might you address this particular problem? Would you speak to him on his own and learn what motivates or demotivates him? Would you run a skills marketplace, a sort of bazaar of skills, if you will, and let him trade some of the things that he's good at with some other folks? Would you tell him just to shut up and get on with it, right? You're bugging us here, Paulo. Just be a team player. Would you bring it up at the retrospective? Hey team, Paulo is not feeling good about this. What can we do for him? What actually would you go and do here? Find a few tasks that he can do on his own, perhaps? So let's take a quick survey. Audrey, if you could go ahead and launch that. I'll give you just a few moments to respond here. So again, you can choose more than one option if you like. All right, give us about 15 more seconds here. All right, Audrey, let's begin to shut it down here, and we'll see what happened. All right, yes, I see many of you hewed to one of the key options I had. Hands down here, speaking to Paulo privately is the one that won out, followed closely by finding a few meaningful jobs. I would agree that in this particular case, that's where you'd want to start. And why? It's because of who Paulo is. He clearly feels uncomfortable in group settings to some degree here. And this is not to say that Paulo's going to go off on his own and become a solo artist again, but giving him the opportunity to work on his own for longer periods of time and focus could be very useful and could really turn him around. So moving on here. Just as a, what if there was conflict in your team? And we'll return to the story of Paulo here in a moment, but what if you have, perhaps Paulo's not getting along with someone and, has a little bit of an issue. Double aces is a specific tactic. It's one that we teach you in our Scrum classes for dealing with basically uncomfortable situations. In many cases, the essence of arguments is a lack of empathy and understanding between people. So often people disagree with one another, not necessarily because they cannot come to an agreement or they have no common ground that's possible, there's no compromise to be found. It's because they don't start from the same place of understanding. They attribute aspirations, they attribute motivations to one another that are not necessarily true. So really what this is meant to do is surface that. And as you see here, it's a couple of different situations. Let me offer you an example. So let's say that we're on a new planet and we're settling this planet, and there are some scary critters out in the wild around our little settlement called womp beasts. Since they're so scary, our security chief here, he comes and he says, we've got a womp beast roaming around basically our village. We need to go and take him and we need to cage him. Or he's going to hurt somebody. Well, perhaps we have an animal lover, a conservationist, and she's investigating a lot of these local fauna and flora, as a matter of fact, and she has an emotional reaction to this. She says, well, are you saying you're going to go and get rid of all the womp beasts? And this is just an assumption. Nothing's been said to this effect, but both people are hearing one another based on effectively very polarized situations. So what we'd like to do here, first of all, is get to the essence of the situation. We want to acknowledge, in particular, the conservationists here would need to acknowledge, okay, so what you're really saying is you're concerned somebody's going to get killed. And of course, they would have a little conversation to that effect. Perhaps we would clarify the situation then. Are you also saying, right, that we would actually cage any womp beast that came around, right, or perhaps eliminate them? And because clearly this is the area of concern for the conservationist. And then we can actually perhaps come to some sort of a common ground here and look for a way to fundamentally meld the 2 points of view, right? What we're trying to do is address both people's core concerns as we go along here. And again, if you start from the polarized point and you leave it there and never come to the center, that's unlikely to happen because people will actually retrench in their positions. So this is a way simply to objectify the situation and allow people to analyze it with a little bit more detachment. What about privacy? Right, we're talking about, again, individuals here in addition to teams and paying attention to both. As it turns out, focus is really one of the most critical things for actually delivering work rapidly. When people get into focus, when they get into flow, they're able to deliver things many times more quickly than they would otherwise. But look at a lot of office environments today and ask yourself, do they really allow for privacy and they allow for uninterrupted flow and focus? In many cases, they certainly don't. I'm sure at some point in all of your lives, you've had a day where you've worked from home. And I'm also sure that at least some of those days, you emerge saying, that was one of my most productive days in some time. And there are obvious reasons for this. There was nobody there to bug you. Nobody except your kids and the dog, of course. But there weren't teams. There weren't distractions running around the office. There weren't people stopping by to say hi. In essence, you were able to put your head down and get your work done. So this is actually important, and it's a good thing. There was a presentation I attended a bit ago that actually described it was actually from the software tool Rally and data from 10,000 teams. It showed something a little bit surprising, perhaps, that teams that were virtual, where the team members were located in different places but in the same time zone, actually outperformed co-located teams, which is fascinating. And you might wonder why. I would ascribe it much to this factor, that even when teams are remote, the likelihood is they got together every once in a while. They knew each other. And as such, they were able to meet, they were able to plan the work they were going to do, and then they were able to go out and connect virtually for the remainder of the time. And this was a good balance between being able to collaborate when you're doing planning, when you're doing design work, when you're, say, refining stories and doing other such things. But when it comes down to individual tasks or even paired tasks, in many cases, being able to shut out the rest of the world is hugely useful here. So part of what we want to do here, perhaps, is say we want people to feel comfortable. And I'll give you an example here. This is everything from phone booths in your office that people can walk into, little conference rooms, going out to the treehouse in the backyard of Capital One and down in Richmond, Virginia. This is, being able to go and sit on your patio and do work. It's wherever you feel comfortable. It's there's a video I show in some of my courses of some school children with a flexible seating arrangement at an elementary level at Fairfax County Public Schools. And just the ability for them to sit where they want makes a significant difference in how effectively they're able to do their work and how comfortable they feel. So this is not an inconsequential thing. We need to make sure people are, actually like the environment they live in, because they're going to do the best work in an environment that suits their mood, right? Similarly, we don't want sound distractions. This is a common problem in open office settings. Many companies, they pull down all the barriers to facilitate collaboration, but they're overdoing it a bit. We need to collaborate with other members in our team, certainly. We do not need to collaborate with everyone in the company at once. And so really being able to shut out distractions while still having options to communicate with one another is really nice. My team and I at Lightspeed, for instance, again, I own and run a consultancy. We're often quite distributed, and as such, we use some virtual tools to manage this. We use one called Sococo. We use Confluence, right? We use various other sorts of virtual tools, LeanKit, Kanban, and these allow us to touch base at the appropriate level of bandwidth and at the appropriate times when we need to talk to one another. But all of that is virtual. Again, this doesn't really do the job for building trust if we haven't met one another. If we never see one another and it's always virtual, then the connections are going to be a bit weaker than they might otherwise, were we actually together. And so we try to do Office Fridays, right, and get together just to be able to speak to one another. So it's critical to find the balance here. There's the notion of ownership. Again, this is often put in a bit of jeopardy by saying the team owns everything. And it's not that that's the wrong idea. Of course, that's exactly the idea you'd like to promote. This is a team affair, and we do want people to be part of a team. But that's not to say that they can't own things themselves to some degree as well. And often this is just a feeling of, say, individual recognition. If I go and bake you a beautiful cake, and then it's the whole family's cake, then it's not my cake, and I feel a little bit of a loss of that pride of ownership. So in many cases, letting people do simple things like demo their own work, like let's say own the actual delivery process, think DevOps here, where they can put something out and they can see instantly what actually happens with the code they just built, as opposed to, let's say, some operations group releases it, and the people who develop the software never see a single metric about how it's used in production. That really disassociates you from the purpose of your project and the purpose of the work you did and the impacts in the real world it's making, and you're really losing some of the emotional attachment that you might otherwise enjoy. Code stewardship, right? This is the idea of we'd like code to be shared to the degree that teams can work together on it, that they can help one another on it, that they can tune it and evolve it and refine it over time. But we also want to make sure that basically, if I build a piece of code, other people aren't immediately ripping it apart and redoing it with no discussion. And that's to sort of point to the bottom left when they're the advice process. This is one of the things that companies like Berts Org, like Morningstar, like Patagonia use to get decisions made. What it amounts to is you can make a decision on your own. You don't have to ask anybody's permission, but you do need to talk to people about it before you make it, so that they could warn you perhaps you're about to do something wrong, or they could give you some advice. And you could ignore the advice if you like, but you have to at least listen to it. And that's a good way of balancing that individual ownership with team input. So trust, right? What you're seeing here is some of my crazy art from the past, right? As a picture I did for my daughter up there. There's one for my noir college days down in the bottom right. There's one I did on a plane in about 30 minutes playing with the new paint tool in the middle. And that's to say, this is one of the skills I have. It's something that I haven't had the time to do a lot lately, but it's something I can certainly teach people. I was an artist for a long time. And so that's something I might like to share. And you wonder, why am I telling you that? This is an example of that skills marketplace that I was mentioning earlier on, that Paulo might play. And as you can see, there are things I'd like to know too. And if any of you out on the line there happen to know these things, perhaps you could join me and I could learn it from you. Why do this kind of thing? Because these aren't work skills here as such, not for my sort of work or yours probably either, at least, but they're personal things. And you can, of course, do a bit of both. It's a trust building exercise. It's a familiarity exercise. It's also a cross-pollination exercise. So it allows us to pick up skills from other people that also are work skills, of course, and that we might find useful. And it helps get teams to know one another. And if you really go up to the broad organizational level here, it can help us build basically companies that have lots of poly-skilled people and T-shaped resources and all these things we hear about, but they don't just happen automatically. So the last thing is community, right? And again, I just mentioned the skills marketplace. This is a little description of kind of how that works. The notion is, and you can see similarly, communities that practice an interest are ongoing mechanisms to accomplish something similar. So a skills marketplace is more of a in-the-moment workshop, if you will. It's something you might do at, say, a retrospective. And it's something where people can talk about both the things they're good at on a personal level and at a higher professional level. And they can use it as a way to build connections with one another. And this is again a good way to stitch a team together while still allowing people to show off a little bit. And so this brings us to one of our second to last section here, the simplest thing that'll work. So if you look at the old organization at the center there with the Eye of Sauron, you might note, what we're saying here is that many companies have plenty of processes. They've had things go wrong over time. And as those things did go wrong, they introduced new processes, new tools, new bureaucracy. And quite often these things accrete a lot more than they disappear. So one of the things you want to do is constantly ask yourself, are we doing things now that we don't need to be doing anymore? And as such, I've got one more poll for you on that point exactly. Do any of you not do these basic Scrum practices anymore in your teams? And if you have stopped doing them, has that helped or hurt you? Right. So, Audrey, if you'd launch into that poll briefly here, I'll just leave this open for a few seconds. Again, you can pick more than one option should you choose. And I've cherry-picked a few of the events here. Of course, you could pick many others at a lower level. You could put estimation at all if you wanted to. So, you know, were you to do this in practice, I would cast the net a bit more widely. Just give about 10 more seconds here for the poll. Okay, Audrey, let's go ahead and shut that one down too. And let's see our results. Again, unsurprisingly, the two at the top there are the ones that get dropped the most often. And I'm sure it's for much the reason I mentioned. In many cases, burn down charts and task estimates, useful actually in the early days in many cases to get teams more familiar with actually breaking down work and sharing it appropriately and looking at it in a lower level fashion, in a more detailed fashion. But in the long run, you might not need it to be able to get the predictability and reliability that your team is going for, and that's what it was meant to do. So again, always look for the areas you can get rid of. And let's close that one out, Audrey. So moving on, we've got one last section here, and this is a quick one, that you need to keep on evolving yourself. Scrum Masters should not be the same day one as they are 5 years down the line. And I'm sure if you're on an advanced Scrum Master skills presentation here, many of you are there or beyond. So one of your more fundamental jobs in the early days is teaching the team how Scrum works, teaching them how to work together, and helping them to gain the skills they'll need in the long term. But you want to do away with this over time. So you might, for instance, just leave every once in a while. This is a little bit of the reverse of the hidden boss scenario, right? Where you're just going away and you're seeing what the team does when you're gone, right? And this will often cause them to step up to the plate. There's an interesting tactic that the Motley Fool uses. They call it, what do they call it? Fool safaris or something like that. I can't remember the name of it, but basically they force people once a month to go on vacation. They do a drawing out of a hat, and if your name gets drawn, they give you $1,500, and they say you're leaving within the next month for a 2-week vacation somewhere, anywhere you'd like to go. You can go hang out at home if you want, but here's your money, and you go do what you will. And part of the reason is, of course, because people need to get time off, and some people are a bit workaholics and don't really do that. But the other reason is a little more interesting, They also do it because it helps to highlight areas of single person dependencies or lack of redundancy. That if someone's gone and everything falls apart, clearly this is a bit of a failing of the business and its supporting processes and the people around that person. So that might show you an area where really you've got a situation that needs to be resolved. You could also play a game. And we teach you quite a lot of these actually in the Advanced Scrum Master class. You're wondering what madness you're seeing here. This is the very last game in our Advanced Scrum Master class. Yeah, what's happening there? Well, you'll just have to come and find out, won't you? Yeah, so we've got here a few patterns. And of these exercises, actually, we provide you instructions for all of them. So it's meant to really balance the idea between teaching exercises, simulation exercises, actually facilitation exercises. So not all of them are simply teaching games, but they're ways actually to run meetings and do other such things. But in every case, we practice them in the class and we give you full instructions for running them on your own with your teams as well. So it's meant to be a bit of a toolkit, if you will. And it brings us to our last bit here. What do you do in the long run as a Scrum Master? Again, you should not be doing the same thing you're doing in the early days as a Scrum Master. Once you're past teaching the team, one choice might be that you leave and they do it all on their own. Perhaps going the opposite direction, you dive right into the team, or perhaps you're already there, acting as a developer, acting as a tester alongside. And if your team is extremely good at this and mature, perhaps any one of them could play a Scrum Master at this stage. You might help grow the pool of competent Scrum Masters. Plenty of companies have lots of them around, but actually, from what I've seen, and don't tell anybody, but most of them stink, right? So what you really want to do here is make them capable. And quite often you can take the best folks and get them to help the people who haven't had as much experience and really bring them to the next level. But this takes dedicated coaching and quite often it can take a little bit of time. So it requires a bit of an investment at organizational level. You can actually begin pulling on maybe 2 or 3 teams. Again, if your teams are great at this, then that's perfectly viable in many companies. Or you could become a higher level coach. And I would advise you to go this way anyhow, because frankly, your teams are going to need you to do that at some level to really solve their big problems. Most of the big problems are not just team problems, they're company problems. So going up into the ranks and being able to change organizational culture and fix things at that level is critical. So in the long run, you can move on up the chain here and become a little more holistically capable. And so with that, I'll say this closes our presentation for today. I've included some interesting references down there at the bottom if any of you like to read a little bit further. And I'll note, please come and attend some of our classes. I'll be, in all due humility here, I think these new classes are some of the best ones we've ever created as a company. They're more interactive, they're more interesting. So the Advanced Scrum Master and shortly enough, the CSPSM, that's the Certified Scrum Professional Scrum Master, the final level for Scrum Masters the Scrum Alliance has. That will be up hopefully later this year. So we're in the process of getting that approved right now. So please, if you have any questions, and Audrey, I noted I could see the questions, but actually I don't see any questions. So if you do, let me know.
All right.
And I'm happy to answer
any questions at this time?
Okay. Well, feel free to ask whatever questions you might have.
All right. Thanks, Arlen, and thanks everyone for joining us. If you don't have questions now, you can send to training or info@Lightspeed. Oh, we've got a question popping up. Arlen, if a team has evolved past SHU, why use Scrum?
It's a good question. Well, I've never limited myself to just Scrum, and I wouldn't advise that you do either. Scrum is and has always been a framework, and the idea is that you made it with other things, and that's to be said that you don't have to use Scrum at all. You can, by all means, drop it. I brought up the Motley Fool as one example during this presentation, and they're an example of that too. They did Scrum for a number of years. They got real good at it. Then they switched to Kanban, and they did that for a while and got very good at it. And now they've got a bunch of tools that they can use when they need them, and they don't use any of them by default. They just do what needs to be done because at this point, they've got a very self-managing company and very fluid interactivity among the people at the company. So I'd say in the long run, you don't have to use Scrum. You don't have to use Kanban. You use what works. And that's why I'm, trying to emphasize this is more about the outcomes than about the means you get there. There's always going to be a better way, and you should always look for it.
All right, and we have another. What happens if deadlines disrupt our sprint cycles, especially when the deadlines are coming from our CEO and business sponsors?
Then I would find out why these deadlines are important first and foremost, and use this as a way to create a prioritization system that is transparent. One of my favorite tactical ways of approaching this problem is using the idea of classes of service in Kanban, which allows you to delineate different types of work items and allows you to assign different prioritization schemes to those work items. So for instance, if you've got deadlines popping up out of the blue, then you might have a policy that, okay, well, if this really is that important, and you do want to press on this a bit, then we can create a policy where when our team sees one of these items crop up, they will automatically choose it in preference to other items within the next 24 hours, let's say, and they'll start it. They can also note that this has demonstrable impacts on their cycle time and their flow and their velocity, and use it as a way to perhaps in the long term tune that system and make sure that you've got a pull system that's not terribly disruptive while still allowing the team to be properly reactive to the business environment. So in many cases, I would, in other words, begin to blend some of this with some of the single piece flow ideas behind Kanban, and again, create a decision-making system that doesn't require the team to get approval and allows them to have autonomous decision-making while still accommodating the business's needs.
All right, we've got a multi-part one next. How do you track and measure technical debt? Who should fight for its prioritization, in particular when the PO prioritizes the backlog and there are no engineering leaders on the team?
Well, the simple answer there is really that the team and the Scrum Master should be promoting for it, I would say, if the product owner is ignoring it. Ideally here, this is something you teach product owners in the early days, and I know I certainly try to make a point of it, that you really need to understand that debt never actually was technical debt originally. It was just called the debt metaphor. And again, it was actually more learning debt than it was technical debt. So in many cases, it was to say that as we build software in an emergent fashion, that inevitably we're going to find ways to make it cleaner and more elegant and also more suited to the actual needs of real users over time as we begin to see how it's used and what its failings might be. And so really what you want to do is say, this is part and parcel of the process of iteration and refinement. And in fact, this is one of the core reasons we're getting feedback in the first place, is to allow us to feed that learning debt that we have and technical debt. So how do we measure it? In many cases, there are a number of ways to measure it, right? Cyclomatic complexity you could look at. You can look at, there are a lot of things, right? I mean, suffice to say, defect rates, you can look at how long it takes the team to deliver things over time and look at patterns. So really it has a lot to do with how clean the code is at a certain level, but it's also how suited at a more subjective level, how suited the application is for its current situation and scenario, which is a little bit more of a discussion, right? So I'd say some of these are hard metrics and some of them are more qualitative metrics. But yeah, in the long run, we'd like the product owner to fundamentally feed all those ideas into their prioritization system and make a balanced decision so that you can have a sustainable delivery process and frankly, so you have a better product.
Great, and that clears out our question queue. If you do have any other questions, send them over to training@lightspeed.com and we'll get those answered. Thanks again, Arlen. Thanks everyone for joining us. We do have a few events coming up with Lightspeed. Arlen's next Advanced Certified Scrum Master training is July 25-26 in Herndon, Virginia. And he's got another one in Columbus, Ohio, July 31st to August 1st. We also host the Agile DC Executive Summit September 12th in Fairfax, Virginia at the historic Fairfax Old Town Hall. And finally, our Agile Leadership Academy, Scrum Alliance Certified Agile Leadership session is coming up September 10th and 11th. Thanks again for joining Advanced Certified Scrum Master Skills Hour with Lightspeed. Have a great day.
Thank you all so much. Hope to see you soon.